Around 75% of the world's mining companies are based in Canada. In recent years, several of those companies have been featured in headlines for accusations of violating human rights standards and bypassing environmental regulations abroad. Both the climate crisis and global injustice more broadly are major talking points for Canada's upcoming federal election. But the mining industry still brings in around 5% of Canada's annual GDP, allowing it to wield significant power over Canadian legislators of all parties. But there are still some politicians who aren't afraid to speak up, including the Honorable John McKay, a Liberal MP who has spent over 2 decades advocating for corporate social responsibility and transparency regulations. Okay, so if you'd like to start just by giving a brief introduction, just talking about yourself, your role in Parliament.
Well, my name is John McKay. I'm in Parliament for Scarborough-Guildwood. I've got 8 elections under my belt. I'm now in the 9th, starting my 24th year in Parliament. And I've sponsored a number of private members' bills, but the one that I think you're most interested in is C-300, which was a glorious failure, but it has lived on and largely kept alive by people like yourself who feel that there should be some level of accountability in the extractive industry, and it's ultimately resulted in the creation of CORE, Canadian Office for Responsible Enterprise.
CORE is the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise. The office receives and reviews allegations of Canadian companies committing human rights abuses abroad, and it's the first office of its kind internationally. I wanted to see what prompted this position to finally be created, and also what other legislative initiatives were proposed and refused in the years leading up to the creation of CORE. But starting off a little more broadly, Canada is home to over half of the world's mining companies. And they are private corporations, but what role do you think the Canadian government has to play in ensuring those companies are adhering to environmental and human rights standards when they're operating abroad?
The core metric, in my opinion, should be, would a Canadian company operating abroad be permitted to do whatever it is the issue in Canada? And if the answer is no, then that company should be held to account. If the answer is yes, obviously we don't have a problem.
So specifically with those private members' bills that you sponsored, there was a 2009 bill that's the C-300 one you mentioned on respecting corporate accountability for mining, oil and gas companies in developing nations. And also the 2014 bill, C-474, which was the Transparency of Payments Made by Mining, Oil and Gas Corporations to Foreign Governments Act. So what prompted you to sponsor these pieces of legislation, and what did they entail?
Well, what private members' bills frequently signal is a discontent in the Canadian public of some kind or another. And there are ways in which issues can be brought before Parliament for debate. And what was surprising and ultimately pleasing about this, both bills, was that they did get a lot of uptake on the part of many members of the public, and I would say even international public, because Canadian mining companies are, as you rightly said, around the world. So it generated a lot more interest than ever I would have thought, sort of getting into it. And I was actually, in some respects, the ideal MP to put this forward, because I'm not in any way, shape, or form dependent upon the mining industry for anything. So the journey of C-300 was kind of interesting in that it starts as a private member's bill in a minority parliament. The then Conservative government quickly moved to create a counselor, an ombuds counselor, which was largely perceived as toothless and useless. And we made it off the floor of the House, into the committee, out of the committee, back onto the floor of the House, and we lost by 6 votes. And frankly, we should have won because we'd counted the votes in advance, but we had a lot of people that had serious washroom breaks just as we were about to vote. Amazing. So, which speaks to the power and influence of a very, very first lobby campaign on the part of the industry. He died, but it had an afterlife, and the afterlife was kept alive by people like yourself and people, citizens, and they were making it an election issue, et cetera, et cetera. The Liberal Party in 2015 made a commitment, so surprise, surprise, they get elected and have to follow through on their commitments, and they have this pain in the rear end backbencher who keeps on bugging them about it, and so so to the credit of several ministers, through a lot of, I would say, unnecessary deviations, we ended up with the creation of the office and Sherry Meinhofer being the ombudsman. So that was 300. 474 was actually on a DoddFrank bill, because a lot of the Canadian mining companies are cross-listed on the New York Stock Exchange and the Canadian Stock Exchange. And so DoddFrank required disclosure of any monies or the certain threshold money is given in order to be able to secure a concession. So you had to actually, with your filings, file that. Americans were requiring it, so we could hardly have a situation where the Canadians could. Again, a glorious failure. Got soundly defeated in Parliament because at that point the Conservatives had a majority.
McKay is referring to the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, part of the U.S.'s legislative response to the 2008 financial crisis. It was passed in 2010 and established new agencies and structures that were charged with the oversight and regulation of several sectors of the financial system.
And now Canada has an obligation to disclose, but the United States doesn't, because when Mr. Trump came along, he pulled that part of the Dodd-Frank bill. So,
yeah.
So how crazy
right.
is that? Yeah. So there's now a legal obligation for Canadian companies to disclose. There's no similar obligation on the part of American companies to disclose. So there we are. There's the cheap and cheerful history of those two bills.
Sponsoring both of these pieces of legislation, McKay faced friction from all sides of the political spectrum, including from within his own party. I wanted to know why he felt compelled to keep fighting, especially in the face of the mining sector's massive lobbying capacity. So what is it about this issue for you, like corporate social responsibility, regulating the private extractive sector, that makes you want to continue championing it after so many years of pushback?
Well, it just pisses me off to have major Canadian corporations not adhere to fundamental human rights obligations and environmental standards. So don't give me all this crap about, it'll make us uncompetitive and all this stuff. There are some things that no corporation should be participating in. The direct or indirect raping of women would be a good start. The direct or indirect poisoning of people's water supply, that would also be a good start. And if that kind of behavior in a Canadian context, the executives of those corporations would be looking at jail time. So, anyways, I guess fundamentally, this is a moral issue.
There have been several past instances of Canadian corporations committing human rights abuses abroad, including a recently settled lawsuit brought against Canadian company Nevson Resources, which was accused of benefiting from slavery, forced labor, torture, and crimes against humanity. Several allegations have also been brought against mining giant Barrick Gold for serious human rights violations committed in northern Tanzania. Toronto-based Yamana Gold has also faced allegations of water and air contamination near the Jacobina mine it operates in Brazil.
Yeah, politically, it's not good politics to be offside with your own party, but it's not the first time and it won't be the last.
Conservative government passed the Extractive Sector Transparency Measures Act. Did you find that to be any sort of progress in the right direction, or was it really just a super diluted version of what was initially drafted?
It was a bit diluted. But the NGO community that followed this were delighted. And I have, I maintain contact with them, and they've largely seen it as positive and working.
In a recent House of Commons meeting that took place this year, McKay exchanged dialogue with the Minister of Small Business, Export Promotion, and International Trade on the deficiencies of the Corps' powers to compel. About 5 months later, I wanted to see what he had to say about that criticism, and if anything has changed since.
What I was taking objection to at the time was that the ombudsperson didn't have the power to compel witnesses or documents, or the production of documents, and which in most instances is probably perfectly fine, since they're trying to, they're largely a consultative, not a consultative, conciliatory body. They're trying to encourage companies to do the right thing, and they have a few abilities to make them do the right thing. Having said that, you always have one company who refuses to cooperate, or always have one bad actor. And the only thing a bad actor understands is when you put a 2x4 over his head. And in this instance, a 2x4 would mean a 2x4 that compels the production of documents or whatever the ombudsperson needs. So I was a little disappointed that the government didn't follow through with that. But
one of McKay's original private members' bills, C-300, actually did contain such a provision. Mining companies in contravention of the standards outlined in the bill would lose support from Canadian trade commissions and embassies. I asked him if he still thinks that type of legislation is the way to ensure that mining companies abroad adhere to the human rights standards and practices outlined here in Canada.
Well, I think that's ultimately where we're going.
Yeah.
I think it's useful to have that as an option. I'd like to be persuaded by both the NGO community and the ombudsperson that she is deficient of authorities, and in which case then we might follow through in some manner or another.
So I wanted to end with a question that looks forward, not just because it's an election year, but also because current events like the wildfires, even here in Canada, and publications like the recent IPCC report, they're all making people more aware of the urgency of a lot of situations, a lot of injustices across the globe, and potentially also making them understand that there is a pressing need to regulate these things, to regulate the extractivist companies abroad, especially those that are based in Canada. Do you see any potential for the passage of corporate accountability legislation like those two bills that were defeated in the past to be passed in the future?
I would say themes and variations, but I would say that there's limitations on legislative initiatives. And I think the other big initiative, and this is what Mark Carney has been talking about, is that risky behavior by a corporation includes risky behavior in human rights, risky behavior in environment, risky behavior in social license, and that is becoming as important, if not more important, than the audited financial statements. And I think that's actually taking off. It's not for nothing that Brookfield Investments, which is a massive Canadian corporation with massive investments around the world, has hired Mark Carney to make sure that when they consider an investment of multiple billions of dollars, that the environmental and social and human rights risk is calculated into the law. That's nothing gets corporations' attention like access to money. If you cut off their access to money, my goodness, you'll think this is the end of Western civilization.
To Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance, and the former Bank of Canada and Bank of England governor. Brookfield Asset Management recently designated him as their head of transition investing toward a post-carbon world. Carney has made recent comments urging governments to increase government regulations on businesses to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and meet global climate goals. Do you think there's any sort of outcome to this election coming up that would make things easier or harder?
Well, I think more or less all parties are on side, and so I think that we should be asking our respective candidates where do they stand, and it's a legitimate question.
Whether it's due to lobbying campaigns of large corporations, political motives, or just willful ignorance, many Canadian politicians take an out-of-sight, out-of-mind approach to the activities of Canadian mining companies abroad. But when those corporations are directly or indirectly contributing to human rights violations and environmental damages, as Mr. McKay put it, it's time to recognize this not as an Eritrean, Brazilian, or Tanzanian problem, but as a Canadian problem that needs Canadian recognition and Canadian solutions.